It's the Christmas of 1989 and my mother scores me a Sega Genesis to call my own. The commercials, the magazine ads, and even the box of the unit itself proclaim this thing to be the arcade at home. It's something that I had been searching for since the early 1980s, and it seemed like I was finally gonna get it. But my early days with the Genesis were actually rather disappointing. I went into Space Harrier 2 and Super Thunderblade expecting arcade perfection, but came away severely disappointed in their quality. My 14-year-old self just had no clue that the Genesis lacked smooth hardware-accelerated sprite scaling, and I genuinely wondered, had I made a mistake jumping ship to Sega? Fortunately, other titles reinforced the notion that the Genesis indeed had some serious power when it came to painting the screen full of impressive visuals. Right off the bat, the pack-in Altered Beast stood beside the arcade rather impressively. The sprites were large, it kept the two-player co-op, the bosses were huge, and it even had multiple background layers where the arcade did not. Ghouls and Ghosts was a killer arcade conversion that was damn near one-to-one. Sega programmed it themselves on license from Capcom, and they showed that the hardware was more than up to doing modern arcade games at home. Forgotten Worlds was another Capcom property that turned out quite well on the Genesis. Again, the visuals were really close, with the massive boss battles and two-player co-op defining that incredible arcade feeling at home. Sega won back a measure of respect with their release of Super Hang-On for the Genesis. While their previous attempts had fallen flat with me, this one was much better and much closer to the arcade inspiration. But it was when Sega released Golden Axe that it became clear that the Genesis was the platform for me. The faithfulness to the arcade for a home version was at a level I had honestly never thought possible, especially considering that Golden Axe had only been released in the arcade a mere 6 months prior. They even added an extra stage to give it a bit more runtime. In this episode, we are going to pick up right around the end of 1990 when the Genesis really starts to turn on the heat and the platform really starts to come into its own. I'd own and support this machine for 9 years of my life, and it's one of my favorites of all time. Remember, we are shooting for actual arcade conversions here, not games with similar names. Hope you guys enjoy the arcade experience at home, Part 3. When Strider hit the arcade in 1989, it was a tour de force of graphical splendor. Huge enemies, great backgrounds, and even the soundtrack was nice. When I first saw it, I watched in amazement at how much better it looked than most of the titles around it. While the Genesis had played host to a number of arcade hits before Strider, it was this title right here that set the standard going forward. Coming in at a then whopping 8 megabits of ROM, Strider was a direct port of the Capcom CPS-driven arcade game. And what a job Sega did in the conversion. Everything about it was meant to mimic the source, and the outcome was nothing short of spectacular. Outside of some color differences and some sprite flicker here and there, the Genesis version was a showstopper. The original had only been released the year prior, so having this at home was something special. I was already enjoying my Genesis at this point, but this radically changed my expectations going forward. The arcade version of Midnight Resistance was a weird one. It used rotary controls to determine your firing direction, something that took a bit of practice. It was a good-looking game though, and had much in common with Konami's efforts of the late 1980s. With Contra establishing my love of the run and gun on the NES, I was very much looking forward to the Genesis version. Unfortunately, we got a lot of cutbacks in the transition. First, we lost the two-player mode, a huge blow that was immediately disappointing. We also got some pretty intense slowdown and sprite flicker, coupled with the usual hits to color. It was still a fun shooter, but from a purely visual standpoint, it most certainly had its problems. To compensate, the music here is redone, and is some of the best tunes you'll hear out of the Genesis. No shit, dude, this is the kind of stuff FM Synth was made for. When OUTRUN hit the arcade in 1986, it was a stunner. It looked so good, ran so fast, and the soundtrack was unforgettable. I adored the game and for years wanted a home version that looked just as good. Luckily, by the time it showed up on the Genesis in 1991, I had gotten over my naive expectations and just took the port at face value. I knew by then the home version had zero chance of replicating the arcade's brilliant technology. What we were left with was a fun enough game otherwise. It was colorful, the gameplay felt similar, and the music recognizable. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot here to be disappointed in given the amount of time that had passed, but superscalers were never gonna be overly impressive on the Genesis. In fact, for all my love and adoration for the platform, its lack of hardware sprite scaling is perhaps its biggest letdown. The venerable Taito showed up in 1991 with a 4-player beat-em-up called GROWL. It was a wild tale of a forest ranger out to stop evil poachers. You had tons of weapons you could use and could even enlist the help of the local wildlife. I don't think I have ever seen so many enemies on the screen at one time in any beat-em-up before it either. When it came home to the Genesis shortly thereafter, it was a big step back. Right off the bat, you lose the 4-player co-op all the way down to a single-player experience. As if that wasn't enough, the graphics engine is much simpler with much smaller sprites and of course the usual hits to color and background detail. It could still be a good time because the heart of the design was so strong to begin with and there are still lots of enemies on the screen, but I'd be lying if I didn't say this one was still a bit of a letdown. I mean, why is this only one player when so many enemies are on the screen? They couldn't sacrifice an enemy or two to drop in a second player? While the Genesis certainly could do some special things in the right hands, it did not lack for its disappointments. Before Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat came along and pushed the fighting genre to the forefront of arcade gaming, there were titles like 1990's Pit Fighter from Atari. It used digitized fighters in arena combat to give something more akin to the stuff like SNK's Street Smart than what we'd see later on. It was certainly eye-catching in the arcade. I hadn't really seen anything like it before, and of course I was always down for something that let me beat the hell out of a friend. When it showed up in late 1991 for the Genesis, it was a shadow of its arcade source material. The fighters were tiny, the background simplified incredibly, and of course the animation is nowhere near as good. It also lost the 3-player competitive mode, now only supporting 2. Opinions of the gameplay vary quite a bit, but I personally never thought it played all that well either. I don't know man, this one just wasn't that great if you were coming from the vastly superior coin-op version. I always enjoyed Atari's 1987 Combat Racer Road Blasters. It was sort of a superscaler version of Spy Hunter, with the main goal of keeping your fuel up and avoiding enemies and obstacles. It was a great looking release back then, and even had a deluxe cabinet that was pretty cool. I had to chuckle a bit when I saw there was a Genesis release. If Sega had trouble getting Superscalers running on the Genesis, just what do these jokers at Sterling Silver Software think they're doing? Turns out the joke was on me, because these guys freaking nailed the look and feel of the arcade. I mean, I was completely blown away. The road moves great, and while the trackside detail is a bit choppier, you gotta respect the conversion. This was a fine lesson for me on just how important developer skill figures into software like this. Sometimes who is doing the work is just as important as the hardware it's on. Taito's CADASH was a strange one in the arcade when it was released. It was a hybrid of a side-scrolling action title mixed with RPG elements. The fantasy-based story had you out to stop an evil wizard from conquering the world, and you could even do it with a friend. You also got a choice of 4 different warriors: the fighter, the mage, the priestess, and the ninja. The setup and gameplay were unique among arcade offerings at the time, and there were even machines linked together to support 4 players. The home version for the Genesis in 1992 saw a few unfortunate changes. The classes were cut in half to only include the mage and the fighter, and the color palette is much too dark, and one of the boss battles was removed entirely. On the plus side, you got some nice large sprites, the gameplay was faithful, and the arcade's bullshit time limit is gone. It won't win any awards for its accuracy, but as far as conversions go, you can do a lot worse than this one. In 1991, Data East released the arcade classic Captain America and the Avengers, a 4-player beat-em-up starring some of Marvel's finest heroes. You could take Captain America, Iron Man, Vision, and Hawkeye into battle against the evil Red Skull and his minions. It was a solid game with very memorable music and sound effects. When the Genesis got its port in 1992, the gameplay was pretty much spot on. Playing them back to back here, it's actually quite amazing how close they feel in timing and speed. Of course, since this was on arcade hardware that could display much more color, the backgrounds take some pretty profound downgrades in detail and complexity. It also only allows for 2-player co-op, but still has all 4 playable heroes. It has its shortcomings, but hell, I thought it was worthy all the way around. About the time the Genesis begins its run in North America, the Neo Geo arcade games begin to show up. In 1991, SNK releases Fatal Fury, hoping to soak up some of that hype that was generated by Street Fighter II. It was a great looking title that used both foreground and background lanes you could fight on. You know the drill. The Bogard brothers Terry and Andy are out to avenge their father and take down the evil Geese Howard. You can also play as their buddy Joe, who is a Muay Thai master. As you'd expect, the Genesis port is toned way down, particularly when it comes to background detail and animations. It was also missing 2 fighters from the arcade version. To put things into perspective though, the Neo Geo version comes in at 55 megabits, while the Genesis ROM is just 12. Considering the huge difference there, I happen to think this turned out not so bad. Its sequel made its way to the Genesis as well. In 1992, arcade gaming would be changed forever with the release of Midway's Mortal Kombat. Never before had we seen such violence in a video game. Oh, it's true, games had some pretty risque content before it, but the digitized images and motion captured animation made it all feel so much more real. Aside from the blood that would erupt from uppercuts and roundhouse kicks during the match, you also had the ability to kill your foe at the end of the match. And these deaths were violent as hell. You could rip hearts out, tear heads off, and even burn your enemies alive. My friends and I were absolutely enthralled by its violence, and once the home version showed up in 1993, the expectations were nothing short of incredible. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it either, the Genesis version was a shadow of the arcade from a graphics standpoint. While it mimics the content as best it can, the color, the animation, the detail, I mean everything about it is heavily compromised visually. Sound effects are missing as well. I did like the weird music it brought along and the gameplay was quite good, but this was 1993 and the Genesis was starting to show its age quite a bit. To its credit, Sega had the balls to allow it to be uncensored, something Nintendo refused to do. Multiple sequels would follow with roughly the same results. Less color, less sound effects, and less animation. Fortunately, they all played about as good as you could have hoped for.
Sub-Zero wins fatality.
Excellent. Finish him.
Street Fighter II is a legend when it comes to arcade games. Capcom crafted one of the greatest titles ever here, and they improved it multiple times with the Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting upgrades in the following years. 6 different buttons for 6 different attacks, plus special moves and combos to master. Each fighter had their own style, and the multiplayer was simply unforgettable. Despite the original coming out earlier in the arcade, the Genesis Champion Edition release didn't show up until 1993, well after other home ports. Perhaps because this uses hand-drawn art and animation, the results here were much more impressive than the Mortal Kombat conversion. You lose some animation, the voices are scratchy, and the fighters are smaller, but I respect the hell out of the Genesis effort otherwise. Most important of all, the gameplay here is as good or better than any other home version you could play at the time. You can even get modern hacks that fix the voices and color, showing us all that it could have been even better. The follow-up, Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers, came out in 1994, and while the gameplay was nice, they utterly ruined the music. Another Midway property was NBA Jam. When it launched in arcades across the United States in 1993, it recaptured the same magic that elevated other sports games like Tecmo Bowl, Double Dribble, and Blades of Steel. By simplifying the game down to just 2 players per team and playing loose with the rulebook, it left you basically in a shootout with your favorite NBA players. The Genesis version was released in 1994, and while pared back a bit, is remarkably close. The players are smaller and the color is much more subdued, but otherwise it looks just like the coin-op. The only real area it truly suffers in is the sound and music, which both see major downgrades. Fortunately, the series got better with each release. NBA Jam Tournament Edition and NBA Hang Time both appeared on the Genesis as well, and are very much worth your time.
He shoots from the outside, and it's good!
Hello, boom, Nakalaka! Boom, Nakalaka!
Capcom was churning out beat-em-ups in the arcade left and right after the success of Final Fight, among those 1993's The Punisher. It had all the trademarks of their design: two-player co-op, crazy boss fights, and of course, plenty of weapons to help you kill the bad guys. It was a great looking game and really captured the feel of the comic book inspired visuals. Shockingly, the Genesis was the only home platform to receive a conversion of it in early 1995. This was done solely for the Western market and developed by the US-based Sculptured Software. Coming in at 16 megabits, it had zero hope of replicating the arcade, and it was downgraded heavily to fit within the tiny ROM. You of course expected to see less color and enemies on the screen, but here you get some pretty lame gems music, less interaction with your environment, and censorship on some of the skimpier outfits. I don't know, I feel this should have been a better game. I never expected one-on-one parity, but Final Fight looked and played better than this on the same hardware. In 1994, arcades everywhere received Virtua Fighter 2, one of the most visually pleasing 3D polygon titles of its era. It was so smooth and the new texture mapping truly elevated it above the original. For a very long time there was not a prettier fighter to be found, and it played incredible as well. I chose this not to directly compare the Genesis version, but to illustrate the divide that was coming for arcade ports. For a very long time, the bulk of home conversions had been 2D in nature, but with 3D polygon technology on the rise, everything was about to change. We were about to see gaming split into two very different paths. While one was reaching a state of diminishing returns, the other was only taking its baby steps to its fullest potential. When Virtua Fighter 2 showed up on the Genesis late in the system's life, Sega didn't even try to make it 3D. No special SVP chip, no miracles of engineering to be had, just a sad 2D effort of a much better game. It was the white flag of surrender that the 16-bit era had come to an end, and polygons were about to take its place as the next big thing.
Fight 1, ready, go!
Much like Nintendo, Sega decided to bring the technology of the Mega Drive to arcades across Europe and Asia. These machines started out with the Megatech system, a dual-screen cabinet that could play multiple games. Each game used a timer that was tied to your credit. Once the timer was out, you needed more money to continue playing. The arcade board was similar to Nintendo's PlayChoice 10 as well. It had multiple slots for additional cartridges that looked just like regular games, but were not directly compatible. Many of Sega's most popular 16-bit titles saw release on this platform: Altered Beast, Shadow Dancer, and Sonic, just to name a few. Some Megatech machines even had Master System titles in them. In 1991, Sega decided to release a new Mega Drive-based arcade system called the Mega Play. This time they did away with the timer-based mechanic, and instead you pay for lives like most normal arcade titles. This meant that games released for it would be modified to have things like extra lives and bonus stages removed, making many Mega Play releases much harder than their home versions. Again, Sega would only release this platform across Asia and Europe. During my time with the Genesis, there had also been the Turbografx 16. They had been released right on top of one another, and this was Sega's direct competition in the years before the Super Nintendo showed up. I had greatly enjoyed the Turbo, and it had some fantastic arcade ports. Like Sega, NEC had banked on these types of games, helping the platform's image as a powerful unit capable of equaling the arcade experience. Seeing R-Type was a revelation. It was so close to the original you needed them side by side to see the differences. Sega's Fantasy Zone was super colorful and very close to the arcade as well. I was somewhat surprised to see this, as Sega seemed to be clamping down on their games appearing on other platforms during this time. Space Harrier even showed up on the Turbo, and I dare say it was quite a bit better than Part 2 on the Genesis. I thought it was smoother and played more faithfully. A port of Bloody Wolf showed up, the only time we'd see the Data East run-and gun during that generation. It had some cuts but was still a really fun time. Irem's Ninja Spirit showed up as well, and it was a damn fine port of the arcade. They nailed this one so close you could hardly tell the two apart. And of course there was the incredible Splatterhouse, easily one of my favorites on the Turbo and one of the best home conversions of its day. Best part was that it played just as well as the arcade. Of course, many more Turbo games were arcade ports, but with the system getting crushed at retail by the Genesis and then by the Super Nintendo, its place in history was greatly diminished. It did much better in Japan, where it got many more games, and is definitely worth some time to play it.
Round one, fight! Tiger! 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 Uppercut! Tiger!
Early in the life of the Super Nintendo, it very much tried to compete directly with the Genesis in terms of arcade ports. It had a number of titles that fall into that category, and like Sega, some turned out great and others not so much. Gradius 3 had the sound and graphics to be a winner, but good God is the slowdown crippling. I have seen few retail products display this much slowdown. I don't mean it's here and there, I mean it's ever present, and at its worst, renders the game nearly unplayable. It was a worrying first step for Nintendo's new console. Fortunately, Final Fight came along and renewed my confidence. Not only was it a great looking port of the arcade, but it sounded and played as well as I could have hoped. The only blemishes it suffered were the lack of a two-player co-op mode, and one of the characters was missing. That really did suck, but it was still fun for what it was. Super Smash TV did the system proud as well. The controller for the Super Nintendo worked great with it, and it had loads of sprites on the screen. It was the best version of this game available at the time. The Super Nintendo really made a name for itself when it got its own version of Street Fighter II, however. At a time when the arcade version was a gaming sensation, Nintendo's platform was the only place you could play it at home in the United States. I have so many fond memories of this, and you really can't argue with the results. Excellent ports of Hyper Fighting and the new challengers would follow. It's one of the main reasons that the Super Nintendo was able to stay competitive with the Genesis in North America. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time was that rare case where the home version was almost better than the arcade. It had more content, and the sound and visuals were top-notch. The only thing it really lacked was the 4-player co-op. There was also a port of the Atari racer Road Riot 4-wheel drive. The Super Nintendo absolutely butchered this game though. I thought Sega did a poor job with its sprite scaling ports, but this looked and played about as bad as it could have. It's ugly, choppy, and a shadow of the arcade experience. Similar to other bad ports like OUTRUNNERS, it is always in a split screen mode, even in single player. I think the Super Nintendo did it about as bad as any home conversion I had ever seen. Fortunately, the Super Nintendo also got ports of the Mortal Kombat games. While there is much discussion about how these games played against their Genesis counterparts, there is no discussion whatsoever about which one looked the best. The digitized images of the arcade look so much better using the higher color palette of the Super Nintendo. I preferred its visuals of the first two games without question. As the Super Nintendo aged, it began cranking out more and more titles made specifically for its hardware, and it was better off for it. The platform excelled at RPG and adventure titles, and of course anything Nintendo made almost always was solid gold. While I considered the Genesis a much more capable machine in regards to shoot 'em ups, I still think the Super Nintendo had loads of great games.
For two! Rebound! Heating up!
During the 16-bit era, there was a legend. It told of a home console so powerful, it could do one-to-one home versions of all its games in the arcade. Everything about it was arcade perfection. It even shipped with arcade-style joysticks right in the box. This miracle of technology was known as the SNK Neo Geo. I was very familiar with its games in the arcade, but the home machine was a distant dream never to be realized. When it came home in 1991, it sold for an astounding $650. As if that weren't shocking enough, the games were often a few $100s at release. So while I'd love to tell you stories about how much I loved my Neo Geo and its arcade perfect games, the truth is, I did not own the platform until many years later. At the time, I coveted the hell out of it though. Neo Geo games looked great in the arcade, and the idea of having that at home was really a dream come true. I had always wished that Sega had done something similar with their System 16 or System 32 boards, create a high-end market to run parallel to their other home efforts. I would have much rather have had that than a Sega CD or 32X. When the Neo Geo CD hit in the mid-90s, the platform finally became affordable, but the CD format had a ton of limitations the cartridge system didn't have. These days I own 2 consoleized MVS arcade boards and flash carts with the entire library, and it's still impressive all these years later.
Birdie try.
Birdie! I did it!
In case you are wondering why the episode focuses so heavily on the Genesis when the Turbografx and Super Nintendo had plenty of arcade ports, well, it's because the Genesis is where I spent most of my time. It was my 16-bit platform of choice, and its games held the most appeal for me. It was during the Genesis that I got my very first job and imported my first Japanese games. I had buying power for the first time and could get the games I wanted when I wanted them. While I played them plenty, both the Super Nintendo and Turbografx tended to have exclusive stuff I went after. They each had a library of must-own software that weren't connected to arcade versions, and I felt their strength were mostly in these kinds of titles. Eventually, the same thing would become the norm for the Genesis as well. It seems to be a pattern for all these older systems in fact. They start out with a bunch of arcade ports, but as they get older they begin to rely on those less and less. I suppose this is because they are much more competitive to arcade technology in the beginning of their lives, but a few years in, the arcade leaves them in the dust. By the time 1994 rolls around, arcade games are starting to be polygons regularly, so the Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Turbografx really had nowhere to go. The new era of arcade technology demanded new home consoles, and the Saturn and PlayStation were right around the corner. I had absolutely loved the 16-bit era though. The games were simply amazing, perhaps the greatest variety and quality the hobby has ever seen. You had games that had been so close to their arcade counterparts that you really did feel like you were playing the real thing, not to mention the massive amount of original content that had been so fantastic. It was an unforgettable time to be in gaming, and with all the new Polygon games right around the corner, an exciting new beginning as well. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.